Hey Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lovis and I would like very much to introduce you to The Bees by Laline Paull. This book is an example of anthropomorphic fantasy as it is told entirely from the perspective of a bee, which is part of a hive, complete with strict class system, religious inclinations, and political intrigue. Bet you never thought about all that happening inside a hive. If you want to know more about anthropomorphic fantasy in detail, check out my latest video where I talked all about this subject, but just in brief, anthropomorphic fantasy is where we assign human-like characteristics to an entity that is not human, like an animal or a tree or something like that. We give them characteristics that are commonly associated with being human, intelligence and culture and complex social norms, speech. Many people don't like these kinds of stories because they don't connect with them very well, but I have always loved them. I love the way that these stories force me to change perspectives, to think about what the world might look like to an animal. The Bees by Laline Paull is one of these stories told from a perspective that I've not experienced very often before, so let's just get right into it. First, a spoiler-free summary. The Bees, as the title suggests, is all about bees, and is told from the perspective of a particular bee named Flora 717. Her name, Flora, is actually an indication of her class, her rank within the caste system of the hive. Each class of bee within the society is associated with a different plant, and each type of bee has characteristics that lend themselves to a particular role within the hive. So teasels are all in the nursery because they produce a certain fluid that feeds the young. Thistles are the guards. They stand at the entrance to the hive and protect the landing board. Floras are the janitorial staff, and they are the lowest class. They are considered dirty. However, Flora 717 is born abnormal. She has characteristics that are not normal for her class, such as the ability to speak, and to produce flow like the Teasel sisters in the nursery, or to produce wax to make the cribs. She's also abnormally large, which enables her eventually to become a forager, etc. The story basically follows her as she tries out each of the roles within the hive, giving the reader a very well-rounded view of everything that goes on in this society. There's also quite a heavily religious aspect to it because there is the queen bee, the queen mother, and all the bees in the hive worship the queen bee, and the class of bee just below the queen is called the sage class, and they are priestesses who basically rule the hive, controlling the hive mind with mantras and prayers, and supported by the equivalent of a police force who cuts down anyone who doesn't conform. Yeah, it got dark kind of quick there, didn't it? Sometimes the extent to which the religious devoutness is observed gets a little tedious, and the way that males are worshipped just for the simple biological fact of being male makes you feel slightly ill. But don't worry, you will be satisfied in the end. I'm very close to a spoiler there, but I wanted to make this clear because those two things were aspects of the story that might have made me put the book down at a couple points. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. It just made me so uncomfortable. But this story is about learning to think for yourself in what, for all intents and purposes, is a totalitarian regime and discover your own self-worth. So just push through those difficult to stomach bits and just focus on the other things that this book is showing you. Though a lot of the story is focused on the culture and society inside the hive, we do get an idea of the effect of humans on the population through the visitation, which is where a beekeeper comes and takes the honey from the hive, which is very traumatizing for all the bees inside the hive. We see the effect of pesticides being sprayed over foraging grounds and individual foragers bringing sickness back into the hive. And worst of all, we see the hive collapsing disease that has plagued our bee populations that we haven't really found a solution for yet. The structure of this book is kind of interesting because as I was reading it, I kind of felt like I was almost reading an episodic TV show. There isn't really one plot arc where Flora 717 has a goal and, the book shows her making her way towards that goal, at least not until very late in the book. And perhaps this is because she's a worker bee and a low-class worker bee at that, in a society where you're not really supposed to think for yourself. The mantra is accept, obey, and serve, which also makes you feel slightly... So for her to have an ambition that would pull her through the story might not have made much sense. But I still felt that every stage of the book was like a mini episode with its own little resolution. The tension kind of ebbs and flows. It doesn't really follow the inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution kind of structure. It's more like a sine wave with peaks and troughs. In some senses that made the book feel longer. It felt like it was taking a very long time to read because I didn't have this tension that was pulling me forward. But on the other hand, each little segment was quite enjoyable. So it's not such a bad thing to just linger in this book a little bit. But it is kind of funny how the structure kind of mimics Flora 717's own emotional maturity. As she grows and experiences things and develops, she gets a bit more agency in the book. And then in the last few chunks of the story, when she really has ambition and has a goal, that's when things really took off for me. One of the most interesting things for me about this book is actually the author and how she came to write it. Laline Paull said she was inspired to learn everything she could about bees when a friend of hers who was a beekeeper passed away, and it was while she was researching and learning about this amazing thing that is the honeybee that she came across these true facts that sparked little bits of narrative in her head. I won't tell you which ones because that would be kind of like giving you spoilers in a strange way, but she discovered that fact sometimes really is stranger than fiction, and the bees just kind of wrote their own story from there, it sounds like. Actually, one that isn't a spoiler is the fact that a queen bee can live between 2 and 5 years, in contrast to a worker bee, which might live a matter of months. So for Laline Paull, that kind of translated very easily into this immortal mother, and a very devout religion dedicated to her, which just informs so much of the story in The Bees. Of course, the famous waggle dance that the bees do also features in this story. I think that is one of my favorite things about bees in general. I love it. I love that they communicate through waggling their butts and doing a little dance. I find that very entertaining. I really love this approach. Kind of letting yourself be inspired by the weird and wonderful ways of nature and just taking that little spark of inspiration and running with it. To incorporate the science and what we know about a species as societal or cultural aspects or as plot points means that the reader, even if you embellish a lot and make it dramatic so that it reads as a story, then the reader might still come away with some idea of how intricate and fascinating these species can be. Honeybees do have a caste system, and they do communicate through this wiggly waggly dance, and they do treat the males in their hives very strangely indeed. And of course their populations are collapsing, and they are affected by the way we farm and develop our land. Laline Paull incorporated all this and more into her novel and gave you just a little taste of the beautiful world that might be right outside your back door in your garden that you never even knew was there. That is powerful ecofiction, whether you like the story or not. So on that note, I think I'll end it for today. I hope you enjoyed this review of The Bees by Laline Paull. And if you did, give the video a like and hit the subscribe button and click the bell so you get notified every time I post new content. My channel is dedicated to reading and writing ecofiction, so if that sounds like it's right up your alley, then make sure you stay updated. If you like what I do and would like to support me, then head on over to patreon.com/ecofictology and become a patron, where your monthly donation, which is very much appreciated by me, also buys me my next book, and it also supports Love the Oceans, a marine conservation organization operating out of Mozambique. If you want to talk more about ecofiction and gather more great book recommendations, then join our Discord server, Rewelding Our Stories. The invite link is in the description below, along with the link for the Facebook group if that is more your pace. So go outside, go find some nature, see if it inspires anything in you. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists. If you want to know more about anthropomorphic for all intents and purposes, wow. It doesn't follow this, inciting incident, rising action, climax. Oh.